So our Lenten series this year is When the News is Bad. For the last 2 months, we've talked about good news of great joy. I love to share good news, but I recognize news isn't always good. Sometimes the news is bad. Sometimes things go wrong. Sometimes everything you can hope for doesn't happen. You get the worst results you wanted. You even look on the TV news and it seems like the news is always bad. When are there good stories we can celebrate? Sometimes things aren't the way we want them to be. And as people of faith, we do everything we can to make them right. But what if they can't be made right? What if there is no easy fix? What then? Jesus talks to a Samaritan woman, and there are a host of reasons this conversation should not be happening. He is a man, she is a woman, and that day it was rare, even inappropriate, for men to speak to women in public. In addition, he was Jewish, she was Samaritan. If you know nothing more than the parable of the Good Samaritan, you know that Jews and Samaritans did not care for one another very much. And yet, if a Jew and a Samaritan were going to have a conversation, there was one question everyone knows would be raised. Where do we worship? She says our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you insist that it's necessary to worship in Jerusalem. It seems to be a question of geography. Where is the best place to pray? Now we know that God is not tied to a place. So what do we do with this story? John editorializes and says, Jews do not share things with Samaritans. Now that is both right and absolutely wrong. They didn't share meals. They didn't share conversation. They didn't share prayers. But they did share history. When this Samaritan woman mentions the sanctuary on Mount Gerizim, well, it's not there anymore. It was destroyed 150 years before this conversation happens. And this Samaritan temple was destroyed by the Jews. John Hyrcanus, the Jewish high priest at the time, was convinced that prayers offered at any sanctuary other than Jerusalem were blasphemous. So he led a raid destroying the sanctuary on Mount Gerizim. In time, power shifted. 100 years later, Samaritans slaughtered Jews. The violence went back and forth, the hatred ran both ways, and everybody bled. Isn't that how it often works? So when she asks Jesus about where to worship, it's not a question about place. It's a question about history. I think most questions ultimately are about history, which is why it's a shame that we don't value teaching as history as much as we should, and falsely believe history is all about learning dates and facts. How many of us in school said, I hate history. I don't want to have to memorize people and places and dates and times. But history is about studying people and journeys, motivations, and mistakes. Whether we recognize it or not, we are all products of our histories, our own and the histories of those who have come before us. I remember visiting a woman named Elizabeth years ago in a retirement community in Peoria. She had no children or family in the area. The church was her family. And I noticed something interesting in her room. There were sugar packets all over her room, on every surface. I assumed she brought them up from the dining room, and one day I asked her about her apparent sweet tooth, and she laughed, habit. I don't even like sugar in my coffee. Well, why is it your habit? She told me about her father, and how whenever he would get a coffee at the drive-thru, he would be asked about cream and sugar, and he'd ask just for sugar. He'd collect that sugar all week and empty it into the family's sugar jar. She went on to tell me how he would save every can and jar, never threw anything out, didn't buy anything new until what he had wouldn't work anymore. Now, I thought it seemed like a lot of effort for just a bit of sugar that cost a few dollars at the store. But his history is different than mine. Elizabeth's father lived through the Great Depression, and that yesterday governed his tomorrow. He never shook the fear that there would not be enough, and that history, that remembrance of scarcity was passed on. Elizabeth remembered the sugar. She couldn't forget. Remembering the past is important. Philosopher and poet George Santayana says those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. But I don't think it's enough to just remember. We must remember rightly. Because sometimes we create our own versions of history that fit with what we want to believe. We can cast blame. We can tell ourselves someone else started the violence, the feud, and dig ourselves deeper and deeper in. I'm sure the Samaritans told the history of their place of worship in one way, and the Israelites told it very differently, and they both pointed at one another. They started it. I find it interesting to go to places like Yorktown in Virginia and hear about the war we call the Revolution, or read books by American authors, but then read it from a British perspective, or visit historical sites that line up with our revolution over there, and the war is remembered very differently. The Boston Tea Party is one of the best examples. In this country, the Boston Tea Party is often celebrated as a great example of revolt against tyranny, civil disobedience, and protest. But the reality is that the tea that was thrown in the harbor was the cheapest tea, even with the tax, the colonists had ever received, and the best quality tea. And the British described the event more in terms of terrorism as a riot. Same history, two very different narratives. You can find the same reality with the attack on Pearl Harbor, the civil unrest in Ferguson, Missouri a few years ago. One history, multiple stories, different ways of remembering and explaining what happened, and thus different lessons passed on. We all have a historical memory, which isn't the same as history. Historical memory is how a society, group, or individual remembers and tells about history. How we remember is not always the way it was. Courtney introduced me to a book called The Way We Never Were by Stephanie Coontz. She argues that many of the ways we believe and talk about how life was in the early and middle 20th centuries are really actually myths. She wrote and researched the book for the search for the supposed golden age of family values in the 20th century, but found that the male breadwinner family of the 1950s was a very recent, short-lived invention, and that during its heyday, rates of poverty, child abuse, marital unhappiness, and domestic violence were actually higher than the more diverse 1990s. How often we think, oh, life was so good back then. It was the Leave It to Beaver family. Everyone was happy. We had this nice, perfect little American families all over the place. If we can just get back to the good old days. They didn't exist. We convince ourselves they did. We say, well, I lived through it. I was there. We can tell ourselves a lot of stories. In the 1992 book, she critiqued the panic over growing family diversity. People were sure marriage would be a thing of the past and the family unit destroyed. Her skepticism about the doomsayers has since been proven correct. Despite the continuing rise of unwed births since 1994, juvenile crime rates have fallen by 60%. Domestic violence is also down 60%. Parents today spend more time with their children than in 1965. The myth is that often parents spent more time with children in the past, but that's not actually been the reality. Parents today are much more engaged with their children than at any time in the modern era, going on back before the Victorians. The tendency for many Americans to view present-day family and gender relations through the foggy lens of nostalgia for a mostly mythical past. See, nostalgia is a very human trait. When school children returning from summer vacation are asked to name the good and bad things about their summer, the lists tend to be equally long. As the year goes on, however, if the exercise is repeated, the good list grows longer and the bad list gets shorter. Until by the end of the year, the children are describing not their actual vacations, but their idealized image of vacation. So it is with our collective memory of family life and our own histories, personal, church, community, and national. As time passes, the actual complexity of our history, even our own personal experience, gets buried under the weight of an ideal image. This happens in churches all the time. As a community, we create an idealized past and remember the good without really being honest about the challenges. We say, oh, if we could just be like we were back 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 75 years ago, everything was great, we were booming, if we can just get back to that, it was perfect then. I hear it all the time going around the churches. Why can't we go back to that? And if you really spend time digging, you realize it was never what they actually describe it as being. But we create this idealized past we long for, and then we get upset that our current version can't live up to what we falsely remember church life was in our idealized image. What our family life was like, what our national life was like. Our current realities can't live up to the perfect pasts we've created. And it creates a disappointment that the expectations can't be met. Perfect things rarely exist, but we create false images of perfect past, then get upset when our presence can't match that perfect. The perfect's often the enemy of the good. We are burdening ourselves with histories that aren't real, and while they are crushing us, we fight to keep what's crushing us intact. Remembering is important, but we often have a false belief about the past, and it can affect our presents and futures. We must remember rightly. See, I often hear people lament about the state of things today, like how the world is so much more violent than it used to be. Historically speaking, the world is a less violent place now than it's ever been. We may more easily hear news of violence, or aspects of it can become sensationalized, but on the whole, the world is much less violent. Which is why when violence does happen, it is news because it's unexpected. Steve Pinker, in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, lays out the evidence that we become less violent, but why we don't recognize that. We are constantly warned of danger and violence everywhere. It makes us believe we live in a more violent world. Distorting our sense of danger is our moral psychology. No one has ever recruited activists to a cause by announcing things are getting better and better. Let's get really happy about it and hit the streets. It doesn't work that way. Bearers of good news are often advised to keep their mouths shut lest they lull people into complacency. So we try to create narratives that things are getting worse and worse. Also, a large swath of our intellectual culture is loath to admit that there could be anything good about civilization, modernity, and Western society. But perhaps the main cause of the illusion of ever-present violence springs from one of the forces that drove violence down in the first place. The decline of violent behavior has been paralleled by a decline in attitudes that tolerate or glorify violence. By the standards of the mass atrocities in human histories, some of the things that are happening today is mild stuff. We may not think that way, but from a contemporary vantage point, we see them as signs of how low our behavior can sink, not of how high our standards have risen. We have a very short view of history. See, the news may be bad, but instead of putting it in its proper context, we distort it, magnify it, and use it to intimidate or influence. We need to remember rightly. One of the other common things I hear now is that how the world has never been so divided as it is now. Well, that's certainly not true, but we say it all the time. We eventually convince ourselves that we're so divided that there's no hope. But in reality, the world is probably more closely aligned on basic views than ever before. Recent surveys and studies have found that even in American politics, we agree on over 85% of things. Yet we hear about that last 15%, a whole heck of a lot, don't we? See, when the news is bad, we tend to only see the worst there is. We need to remember that there is more to the story, and the bad news isn't the only news. The Samaritan woman had a question about the geography of worship, but it was really about history, or better yet, it was about the future. I think she wanted to know if it was possible to move past the damaged history that had been misremembered for generations, in which each side vilifies the other while painting themselves as innocent victims. It's a problem still happening in the Middle East. Long histories held on to in ways that were never real or true because both sides can't be blameless and purely innocent victims. See, I think remembering rightly involves honesty, in which we decide not to deceive ourselves, to not assume the best or the worst, to accept blame when we need it, share it when appropriate, but also to remember with grace for yourself and for others. No one is perfect. Why do we keep expecting it of ourselves and everyone else? Remember, but we don't have to be tethered to a remembered past so tightly anymore. We can indeed worship together. We can put the sugar packet down. We can find the common ground. We can love one another. We can move on and forward. Remembering rightly can be liberating. Honesty usually is. We don't have to live under the weight of a perfect past that never existed, the way we never were. We don't have to believe things are worse now than ever before. We can take the long view, the wide view, the Christ-centered view, and see we are part of a longer journey that we did not start and we will not complete. It's not all on us. But Jesus Christ took it all on so that in the end all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be made well. Sometimes remembering rightly is remembering with full honesty and yet with grace. I think grace fills John's story of this Samaritan woman. When she is honest with her own life and her own past, she was able to find what she's really looking for, the living water she didn't even know she needed. She is welcomed, she is heard, she is forgiven, she is given good news, and ultimately she is part of the church. For in John's church, by the end of it all, there were Samaritans and Jews together. The groups that thought neither could ever coexist, eventually they're in one church. I don't think they forgot their past, just remembered it rightly, with a bit of grace, honesty, and humility. When the news is bad, we must remember rightly, because it may not be the only news, and it may not be the worst news. We must remember that there is more to this story, and ours isn't the only story happening right now. These are stories interwoven with ours that go back to the dawn of time. We can remember those stories too. Jesus asks us to remember. So we come to this table and we remember. It's one table for all, one God, one Lord who gave his body and blood for us, and asks us simply to remember rightly, with honesty, humility, and grace. So come to this table and remember the God who loves you and is with you and is for you now and forever. Come, taste and see that the Lord is good. And remember, there is always a place for you here, at this table, in the heart of God.